Y bueno, bueno, esta semana. Pero ese es el.
La transmisión en vivo. Permítame.
Bueno, pues hay varias actividades por ahí vamos a tener el programa, les decía, bueno, por ahí está el programita de toda la semana, el evento es International Seminar on Language Teaching 2022. Todos los días de la semana tenemos pues, varias actividades, ¿no? El día de hoy ahorita ahí está la conferencia de la maestra. Y luego hay otra enseguida, luego por la tarde hay otra actividad. Así va a ser durante toda la semana bastantes actividades. Y pues bueno, la idea era hacer esto dentro del marco, digamos, de la cercanía, ¿no? Del día del maestro, de hacer esta semana como, pues, dedicada más bien a esta actividad que es muy importante para nosotros, que es la enseñanza de la lengua, ¿no? Que realmente, ahora sí que como la actividad con la que surgió nuestra facultad, ¿no? Con la enseñanza de las lenguas, entonces, pues es muy importante. Así que, pues bueno, les doy la bienvenida a este evento. Espero que vamos a ir contando con su participación en el resto de la semana. Y bueno, le dejo el micrófono a la maestra Ida Martínez para que haga la presentación.
Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos. Como dijo el doctor Saldívar, vamos a empezar o dar inicio con este seminario con el taller de la maestra Browning. Miss Browning tiene una licenciatura en español y estudios latinoamericanos y una maestría en piso, enseñanza de inglés como segundo idioma. Durante los últimos 15 años ha estado enseñando inglés en México, Costa Rica, China y los Estados Unidos. Asimismo, impartió clases aquí en la Facultad de Idiomas durante el periodo 2017-2018 por parte del programa de la English Language Fellow, proyecto del Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos. Actualmente trabaja en Milwaukee Area Technical College, dando clases a inmigrantes y refugiados de todo el mundo. Démosle la más cordial bienvenida y le cedo el micrófono a la maestra de Estado.
Okay, are you ready for me? It's really kind of hard to hear you guys, but ready? Yes. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Liz Browning, and I'm happy to be here with you guys, at least virtually. I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully I'll be able to share some interesting things with you today about error correction. So a little about me, like Aide just said, I've been teaching for about 15 years in different parts of the United States, in Mexico, in Guadalajara, and in Mexicali, and in China and Costa Rica. And I currently work with immigrants and refugees at Milwaukee Area Technical College. Milwaukee is my hometown. It's about an hour and a half from Chicago. So it can be very cold most of the year, but finally we have some good weather, but definitely not as hot as it is there. Like Aide said, I was at Wabese in 2017 to 2018. So here's some pictures from then. This is another workshop I gave, and here I am with some of your teachers and administrators. It's a program through the State Department that they send teachers all over the world to help train other teachers. So this is just a little agenda of what we will be doing today. First, I want to talk about, or have you think a little about your previous experiences with error correction. And we're first going to think about it as learners. So how it happened to you when you were learning a language. Then we're going to talk about an important concept, which is the affective filter. Then we're going to look at some important aspects to consider when correcting students. And we're going to do some activities so that we can work together. Most of this workshop will focus on error correction in speaking when students are speaking. But at the end, I will talk a little bit about giving feedback in students' writing too. And then we will have a reflection and have time for questions or comments. But if you have questions during, that's fine too. You can ask me, maybe get Aide's attention and let me know, because it's hard for me to really see you all that well. But so feel free to ask questions whenever. So first, like I said, I want you to think about your experiences as a language learner. So learning English or learning your third language. And I want you to try to remember a time when a teacher corrected a mistake you made. How did he or she do it? And overall, was it a positive or negative experience? So take a minute to try to think of a time, and then I'd like you to discuss it with someone next to you. So I'll give you a few minutes to try to remember a time that a teacher corrected you. So.
So they correct me. So I did. It was positive, yeah. And they were like, okay, you have an Yes. And when I was
So would anybody like to share with the whole group a time that you remembered a teacher corrected a mistake? And you might have to use the microphone so I can hear you well, or talk really loud. But does anyone have an experience they'd like to share?
Okay, here we have.
Hi, my name is Reyes. I'm studying language teaching. I'm in 5th semester, and I do remember my first day actually here at Facultad de Idiomas. And we were taking some notes, and the teacher was going way too fast. So I tried to use some abbreviations in my notes, in my personal notes. And then this teacher checked my notes and said, "What's cause?" And I'm like, "Well, it's a quick abbreviation for because." And she proceeded to humiliate me in front of the class. So I didn't like it. I didn't like it. I still hold a grudge to them.
Okay, so it was
It was
Not
very
a good-
traumatic.
Okay. So yeah, so not a very good experience, I guess.
Thanks to that, I have a little bit of issues with correction. I think before I wasn't that aggressive when getting something corrected, but that made me a little bit more or more aggressive when I get feedback and it's not correctly done.
Okay. Well, hopefully today you can maybe change your thinking about error correction, or
Yes.
we can look at ways for when you are teachers, you cannot make your students feel that way. That's the hope. I think we'll go on because I have a lot I want to try to get done. But I was expecting a lot of you to maybe say it was a negative experience. And a lot of that is related to what's called the affective filter, which you may have studied in second language acquisition. But basically, this is a term from the linguist Stephen Krashen, and it's that your attitude or a student's attitude or emotions or feelings about learning a language affect how well they can learn. So if students have negative feelings about learning, it's going to make it more difficult for them to learn. So I think this is very important to think about when we are correcting students, because if we correct them in a way that makes them feel embarrassed or upset, ashamed, frustrated, if we're creating negative feelings for them, they're not going to learn as well. So we say that we want to try to lower the affective filter so there's not something blocking our students from learning. So that's what we need to think about when we are correcting students, because we do have to correct them for them to learn, but we want to try to make the classroom be a comfortable place. So in order to be able to correct effectively, there's some aspects to consider. And I kind of have like our 5 WH question words here. So one thing to consider is what to correct. One thing to consider is whether to correct, because you don't always have to correct students. So think about if or whether we should correct. Think about when we should correct, how we should correct, and then who. Should the teacher always be correcting, or should they try to get the students to correct themselves? So we're going to look at each of these today. First, if we're thinking about the what to correct, it's important to think about there's different kinds of mistakes. So some are called slips and some are called errors. Slips are things the students know. They've learned this, they can use it well most of the time, but maybe they are tired, maybe they are nervous, maybe they're not totally paying attention, so they make a mistake that they wouldn't normally make. But with slips, depending on the situation, they can sometimes just be ignored. They don't need to be corrected because we know they know that. Or sometimes we can point it out and they're able to fix it themselves. And we'll look at ways to do that. On the other hand, errors are caused by a lack of language knowledge. The students make that mistake because they don't know the correct form. And in that case, we do need to correct it and explain it. So first, when we're thinking about what to correct, we have to think about what kind of mistake it is. And just to make that a little more clear, I have some examples. So first, if we have an advanced learner and he's talking about his brother, and he says, I went to visit my brother. Her house is really nice. So if we're thinking of an advanced student, he should know that with brother, he, the possessive pronoun is his. But sometimes he's just not totally paying attention. This might happen. At my school, we have 6 levels, and I teach levels 5 and 6. So I mainly teach advanced students, and they definitely know this, but I hear this mistake sometimes. So depending on the situation, I don't always correct it because I know that they know it. And I know that they usually, most of the time, use it correctly. But if you have a beginner student and they say, I buyed a book, maybe that's because they don't know buy is irregular and it should be I bought. So in this case, this student needs to be corrected. You need to explain the past of buy is irregular and it is bought. So look at the kind of mistake that it is, or we also just correct in a different way. Also, if we're thinking about whether to correct, we need to think about what our goals are. So if your goal is accuracy, which is using the language correctly, maybe using specific language you're learning correctly, you're going to have different ways that you correct your students. If the goal is more fluency, getting them to communicate, getting them to speak as much as they can or write as much as they can, but the accuracy is not as important, we treat that in a different way. So this could be a larger goal. If we're talking about knowing our students, most of my students are immigrants learning English to live, to go to the grocery store, to go to work, to talk to their kids' teachers. They really just need fluency. They need to communicate. So overall, I know that's their main goal. But we also can look at this within an activity, within a lesson. You will have some lessons for your students that are focused on building fluency, and you will have some activities that are based on building accuracy. Depending on the goal, you will correct in a different way. So to kind of look at that, I have 5 different activities here, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to discuss with the people around you. I want you to read the activity and think about, is this activity trying to build fluency so they can just communicate a lot? Or is it trying to build accuracy? Is it trying to get them to use correct language? So take a couple minutes, try to decide, is this fluency or is this accuracy? And then we'll check together in a couple minutes.
Yeah.
Are we good? Do you want more time?
So I was discussing with my partners here, and we thought that they're working with fluency and accuracy, since they have 5 instructions. But on the second one, it's working more on accuracy instead of fluency. But on the third instruction, when the students at that level are discussing climate change, they need to know, certain words in order to explain a little bit more about the topic. And well, I think the full activity in my last vacation is focusing on fluency and accuracy. So yeah.
Okay, so let's look at each one. So the first one, a teacher gives her students the topic, my last vacation, tells them to write as much as they can about that topic. Yes, you do need maybe some specific language to do that, but I would see that as more fluency because we're just trying to get them to write as much as they can. The teacher also said, make sure to use simple past tense, then that would be more of an accuracy task. But a lot of these are always both because there is a blend. 2, here we have, they're working on simple past, that is accuracy. So if your students were working on that and you hear mistakes, we definitely would want to correct those then, because that was our focus. And the third one, they're discussing climate change and possible solutions. So yes, they definitely need vocabulary for that. But I think most of the time when you're having them discuss something, you're trying to build fluency. Are they able to communicate their ideas? The fourth one, comparative adjectives. This is a specific language feature. We're looking more for accuracy there. So if they get those wrongs, those exercises wrong, we want to make sure we correct them, write them, because we're trying to look for the correct forms. And then the last one, I don't remember which one you said, but the last one, I would see that as fluency. So to ask them to describe the picture, we just want them to communicate about that. But of course, to be able to communicate, people have to understand you. So you do need a certain amount of accuracy. But for all of these, you will probably correct your students. It's more of when you should do it or how you should do it, depending on the goal of that activity. So speaking of that, so our next thing to consider, our next WH word is, I'm wondering if you all think, is it always good to correct students right when they make a mistake? So do we need to correct them immediately or wait? Why or why not? And if you want to turn to your partner for just like a minute or two, you can, and then I'll also ask for a volunteer to tell me what they think. So does anyone think, yes, it's always good to correct students right when they make a mistake? And if so, tell us why. So otherwise, do people think it's not always good? Does anyone want to tell us why they think that?
In my opinion, I think it's not always good to correct students, especially in early levels, because they're trying to produce a message. And any type of correction done at the wrong time or in front of their classmates or in a hostile environment, I think it can makes the student to stop trying to produce a message or try to communicate in the target language. In this case, if the mistake or error doesn't, that it makes the message understandable, I think there's no point to correct. Otherwise, if the person that is receiving the message, if they don't understand, I think it's important to take a pause and do the feedback, but not directed to the student, but to the class in general. Like, oh, I noticed this thing, you know what? We can try to improve our pronunciation or sentence structure or grammar or whatever you're trying to focus in with. And yeah, in my opinion, it's not always good to correct on the spot. You can either make a pause for them to try to receive peer-to-peer feedback, or you can, if it's not that important, you can wait until the end of the class to provide a general feedback.
Good. Yeah, I definitely agree. So it's not always good. And actually what you said, talking about later, I'll talk about in a minute, because I think that's a really good technique. So. What? Okay. Yeah, if someone else wants to answer.
And with the student, because whether you mentioned that, sometimes depending on their level or how advanced the student is, people tend to slip up, and that's understandable. And sometimes correcting immediately isn't really necessary, because people do tend to correct themselves, and sometimes it's very important to realize your own mistakes, because it helps you understand or not forget things that you remark your own errors. And personally, that helps me more sometimes. But let's say another example like that. Depending on the situation would be if the student is presenting something or trying to get to a point, you're not going to stop them on the tracks and tell them, "Oh, you did this wrong." I don't think that would be necessary, but I think it's important to say, "Hey, these things mixed up. This thing you didn't notice." It's like about who you're talking to, or who is it about, and when it's going on.
Good. It was a little bit harder to hear you, but I think one of the main things you said is it's really helpful to try to correct yourself, right? Is that so? Yes, I agree with that as well. And I think you said you don't need to correct everything, which I also agree with. So good. So just some things that I do. If I'm going to correct during an activity or right after they make the mistake, which I don't do always because it's not always good. If I can do it in a way that doesn't disrupt them too much, maybe I will. And one technique I often use for this is called reformulation. So basically you repeat what they said, but using correct language. And in this case, they may notice their mistake and correct themselves, or they may just continue on and you don't want to disrupt the activity too much. But a lot of times, especially students that might be a higher level, they can notice their mistake. So for example, if a student said, I have go to Los Angeles, you as a teacher might say, oh, you have gone to Los Angeles? You're giving them the correct language, but it's not like you're saying this is wrong, you did this wrong. You're just kind of joining in their conversation. So this is the way I would recommend during an activity correcting. Otherwise, waiting till after, which is what you said. So I think this is a really good way to do it, is take notes while your students are talking and working on something. You can take notes, and listen for the content of what they're talking about, their grammar, their vocabulary, their pronunciation. And then afterwards, it can become a mini lesson. And then the whole class benefits from that. So they can all learn and nobody is embarrassed by you saying, you said this wrong. So this is a good way to correct. They're seeing the error corrected, but you're not doing it in a negative way. Or even what I like to do is take notes of the mistakes or things I hear, and then maybe write them on the board and ask them what's wrong here. How do we fix them? So again, the whole class is working together to fix that mistake. So I recommend this as much as possible. I mostly, for the past 2 years, I've mostly been teaching virtually online. So it's a little different than walking around and listening to your students, but I've still been able to do it with when I put them in breakout groups. So another, if we're looking at our WH words, how to correct, something important, I think, is to always point out something a student did right instead of only correcting the error. So for example, if you're checking vocabulary exercises and the student chose the wrong word, but they used the right part of speech, I say something like, good, we do need a noun there. So I'm complimenting them that they chose the right part of speech, a noun. But I might say, but that's not the right noun. Can you think of another one from the list? So you are correcting them, but you're giving them positive affirmation as well. My teaching, I was recently observed by an administrator, and she said that she really liked that I did this. So I wanted to include this because it is a good strategy. And the second person who talked, I think you said it's really helpful to get students to correct themselves and maybe they learn better. And I definitely agree. So, but sometimes we can give them a little bit of guidance to help them correct themselves. So with our facial expressions, with gestures, I don't know, if I'm trying to get my students to use past tense, I often do something like this. Your intonation. So if you just repeat what they said, but your voice goes up. If you stress a part of the sentence, if you repeat something, or maybe you ask them a question which makes them realize they need to correct that thing. So I'm going to give you some examples. So for example, if a teacher and student are talking and the student says, if I pass the exam, I would go to the party. And the teacher says, if I pass the exam, I would go to the party. And then the student notices, oh yes, if I pass the exam, I will go to the party. Maybe they're able to notice they had the wrong form. So what did the teacher do here? And point them the mistake. How did they correct? If I pass the exam, I would go.
The teacher intonate the word like better, and in a way that it can sound louder so they can catch the error words.
Good, exactly. So they stressed that word. They said it louder and stronger so the student could hopefully catch that there was an error in that part. Perfect. Or same example, the student says, if I pass the exam, I would go to the party. And teacher says, would go. What did they do here?
Hi.
Hi.
The teacher emphasized in the student's error. In this case, would go, and the student realized like, oh yes, it's true. I made a mistake or I made an error, so I will go to the party. And
Good.
then the students corrected.
Perfect. So yeah, so this teacher emphasized it again. They just repeated the part that had a problem instead of the whole sentence, which hopefully would make the student realize that. This is a different example, but if the student says, I want to have 3 childs when I grow up, as your teacher might say, do we say childs? Oh, no, I want to have 3 children. So what did we do here?
Someone?
Yeah, anyone?
Hello. We like don't correct it, but make them remember the way they're saying it's wrong, and that it should be the other way.
Good. So we tried to make them remember or notice child is irregular plural. With this correction, when you actually ask a question, I think you need to be careful with how you say it because it could maybe embarrass the student, whereas these 2 ways are maybe less pointing it out and less embarrassing. But you can ask questions too without saying it's wrong, but just asking them a question. Maybe they'll notice it's wrong. Good. So now I want to put together all of these that we've talked about, what to correct, whether to correct, when to correct, how to correct, who should correct. So I have some examples of activities. So it tells you what you're working on, and then an error or a mistake a student would make. And I want you to decide, and you can talk to someone next to you. Would you correct this mistake right away? Would you correct it later? Would you not correct it at all? And if you would correct it, how would you do it? So we have one situation. I'll let you talk. We'll all talk, and then we'll move to the next one. So if you were in the classroom and your students made this mistake, what would you do? So take 2 minutes maybe. Discuss, and then we'll check together.
Sí, pero sí iba a decir eso de que a lo mejor otra cosa después, pero no hay mucho ya porque el primer día de la clase.
Como hacer secciones notas en secretos, pero no adelante y después es el primer día. Después, como ejemplo o algo así, como parte de la clase, son como 15 cosas. Es que dice es el primer día de clase. No, sí, pero o sea, tanto todo el día.
Liz, ¿me escuchas? Tenemos 2 minutos para ver si ya hay una sesión de preguntas para terminar. ¿Qué?
Tenemos que terminar en 2 minutos.
Ya.
Ok. Okay. Angelica said we don't have a lot of time, so maybe I'll stop you guys so we can talk about this one. So would someone like to tell me what they would do if your student made this mistake?
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, first of all, I would like to know if they're like in first semester or which level, right? Because if they're like brand new people, I wouldn't say something like, hey, you're wrong. No, or point that out at the moment. I would just say something at the end of the class, like I noticed some mistakes or something like that, or some other day just as part of the class, not like, yeah, you did this wrong, or like, oh, when you say this sentence, you'd say this and this and this. I don't know, that's what we thought.
Good. I guess it is important to know the level, but I agree. It's really, the one big important thing is it's the first day and it's a getting to know you activity. So that should be trying to make the students comfortable in class. You don't want to be correcting them right away. Did somebody else want to talk?
I just want to say something. Yes. Well, if a student say like, yes, I am having 2 sisters, I will say like, oh, you have 2 sisters, like showing interest in the students, and they will like, oh yes, like, and they continue to sharing, I don't know what they like to do or something about their life.
Yeah, perfect. So using the reformulation, you say it correctly to them, but it looks more like you're interested, you're not overtly correcting them. So yeah, that's good. Okay.
It's me again. For the third time. I would use a technique very similar to my classmate. I actually would take advantage of being the first day, because that's the time when you can share to your students things about you and your personal life, and it's not out of context. So, oh, you have 2 sisters? Oh, I don't have sisters, but I do have a brother. So they can see how I model the information and the structure on the sentence, and they can try to mimic what I said, so they can correct themselves by inferring what I'm trying to communicate to them.
Yes, perfect. Giving them a model and again, sharing about yourself and getting to know you. That's what we're trying to do is get to know your students, let them get to know you. So I think that's great. So, and like I said, we should be finishing up, but I will share this presentation with your teachers so you will have it. I have a few more situations. You could later think about what you would do and think about these same things. I also, we could do a whole other workshop on writing feedback, which we don't have time for. But, I did include what I usually use when I correct my students, which are proofreading marks that I try to, let me see if I can share that. I tried to get the students to correct their own mistakes, just like in speaking, try to get them to correct their own mistakes in writing. So I don't correct the errors, I underline them and tell them what kind of mistake it is. So for example, if it's verb tense, I underline it and I put VT or prep or all of these things. And when I first introduce these, I do a practice with them where we look at examples of errors, we look at the symbols, and we make the correction together. One thing that can be overwhelming about correcting writing is knowing what to correct. So generally I say correct only the target language. So if you're working on specific grammar, you have them write something, just correct that, or correct only the language you know is at their level, they're able to use. And it's also good to tell your students ahead of time, before they do work, tell them how you will correct them. But maybe I can come back someday and talk more about giving writing feedback. Most of my teaching is teaching writing and grammar. So I like correcting writing, even though I know some teachers don't. So then I guess we have time. I'm wondering, we don't really have time for that, but any questions, any comments? Have you changed your ideas about error correction? Anything you'd like to ask or say?
I missed me again, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Actually, was looking forward for writing correction because I tend to, well, in my opinion, I think that I tend to overcorrect a little bit while I'm focusing on grammar. So I would like to know if you have any tips on how to avoid overcorrecting.
To avoid overcorrecting?
Yes, to avoid that.
So kind of like I just said, is think about either what are you trying to get them to work on? Are there specific grammar points you want them to show you, and only mark those, because otherwise it will be overwhelming. Or think about what is the grammar that they should know at this level and only correct that. But it's hard not to want to correct every error, but I think it's choose what you're looking for and tell your students, say, I only corrected verb tenses because that's what I want to focus on, but that doesn't mean it was perfect. So I guess you don't have to correct everything, but let them know there still were other errors. I also, so I'll share those materials with you, and if you still have more questions about writing feedback, I will give you all my email address too. So if you have questions or you want to contact me, I can send you more things. I don't know if that answers it very quickly, but other questions?
No questions? Well, we're gonna finish this interesting conference. Thank you, Ms. Browning. Para terminar, quiero leer, bueno, no sé si sepan, pero Ms. Browning habla español. Hola, ¿me escuchan, Ms. Browning? Sí. ¿Nos escucha, Luis Brownie?
Sí, más o menos.
Ok. Voy a leerles su constancia. Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, Facultad de Idiomas, otorga la presente constancia a Liz Browning por impartir el taller Effective Feedback and Error Correction Techniques en el marco del International Seminar on Education 2022 a la comunidad estudiantil en Facultad de Idiomas de la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, en la ciudad de Mexicali, el 17 de mayo de 2022. Por la realización plena del hombre, doctor Lázaro Gabriel Márquez Escudero. Le vamos a hacer llegar la constancia, maestra. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Le agradecemos muchísimo su participación en este evento. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Nos invitamos a seguir con nosotros. Vamos a continuar con la siguiente plática. Es la plática Desafíos, debates y prioridades en la educación profesional en Alemania. Esta va a ser impartida por el maestro Juan de Dios Ocampo Peña, quien está en Alemania y está enseñando clases de español para extranjeros. Así de que su experiencia creo que va a ser muy valiosa para nosotros.
Okay. ¿Ya me voy? ¿O?